day to you. This is Anagalactic bringing you another science presentation in astronomy. You might ask why go to subatomic physics when the goal is to describe the universe. Part of the reason is here to my left. It's Ruđer Josip Bošković. Croatia is a Slavic language speaking country. We're going to be reading just a little bit from the preface. There were 5 editions of his book called Theoria Philosophiae Naturalis, which is the older name for science. This is about 250 years ago that he published what I think is one of the most amazing books of science ever produced. His name is coming back up at top-level physics today. That's a curious looking graph. It's called a binary tree. And at the bottom, you'll see the number 0, a most significant number, which I've covered in several lectures. It's due to a man named John Horton Conway, who died only 3.5 years ago of the COVID virus. I consider his work to be a benchmark. This is a diagram of the surreal numbers. And it's a most amazing graph because it is actually the definition of the linear number system. I have dealt extraordinarily in depth with the linear number system for obvious reasons, because I've discovered the spherical number system, which is antecedent to the linear number system, not in human history. As you well know, we only know about linear geometry. Linear geometry is the only geometry that's ever been used by science. That is no longer adequate, and in order to break the logjam, it had been necessary to probe some fundamental error that had been made that led us to the impasse that we now face in astrophysics and in quantum mechanics. I've identified the source of the problem. It is, in fact, our number system. So that's the bracketing information from that perspective. And now I want to show you a little bit more. Again, this is Ruđer Josip Bošković, a man who lived in the 18th century, that is, the 1700s. He was a Catholic Jesuit priest at a time when the Jesuit order was disbanded. It didn't really affect him. He wasn't exactly a priest as much as he was a top-notch mathematician and scientist, and was the most respected name in mathematics and physics in Europe, following the deaths of Leibniz and Newton, which occurred in the first quarter of the 18th century, when Ruđer was a very young man. He published this book, which I'll show you very quickly. On the screen you'll see The Theory of Natural Philosophy. You can get this book for free online, download it, or just read it online. And we're going to be reading from the 1763 edition. There were 5 editions of the book, 2 preceding and 2 subsequent to the 1763 edition, which he himself approved of. He had worked on his theory, which is a theory of forces. Now all of this will become clear, but the bracketing information is, for this lecture, that we are dealing now with Ruđer Josip Bošković's theory of force balance in the universe. The reason his name has come back up in top-level physics is he actually discovered the quantum. He also discovered the force balance inside the atom over a century before the atom was discovered. So if that's not exciting, I don't know what is to a scientist. It certainly is to me. The reason for mentioning the surreal numbers is that I gained a critical insight from the surreal numbers of John Horton Conway. Let me show you that one more time. You'll see up in the upper left now. I don't have a pointer. I'm sorry, my software doesn't support that. But you see from where I'm pointing with my finger, that's 0. The next line up is 1 and -1. Those are the linear numbers. And the next line up, disregard the negative branch, which is to the left. We're only concentrating on the right branch. And the next line up from 1, you'll see, according to John Horton Conway's tree, that it now divides into 2 1/2. Just to give you a teaser on what that actually means, certainly to me, that is the wavelength frequency relationship. Those two numbers multiply to 1. You can disregard everything above that, where it splits to 3 and 1/2. That's actually incorrect, but it's not incorrect in defining the linear number system, but there are two number systems apparent here. On line 1 is the linear number system, and on the positive side of the second line up is the quantum number system, which I discovered in 2022. Currently, I'm writing a LaTeX document for publication in Archiv, and I'm only going to tell one story before we start our reading and get into this. Archiv is a publishing site where anybody is allowed to submit a document. You don't need a professor ruling over you to give permission for you to publish in some scientific journal, because you can go to Archiv. And the only reason I mention that is to bring in a story which I think you'll find very interesting if you've never heard of a man named Perelman. Perelman is a Russian Jew. He's a most amazing man. All three of the names that I've just mentioned are at the very, very top of cutting-edge science, even though Ruđer lived about 250 years ago. He is one of those three names. John Horton Conway was a master. He was a polymath, I believe one of the last of the polymaths, if not the last. And his discovery of the actual definition of a number is not really published very much. I mean, that is a major discovery because science is based on the linear number system. You may not be aware that there is only one number system, although you've heard of others, certainly the complex numbers. Those are actually linear numbers. There's a footnote to that, but we need linear numbers because they're the computable numbers. One of the major obstacles when I realized that I had discovered a new number system, are they computable? They are, and I've proved that. So, we're going to get right into it, but first the story of Grisha Perelman. One of the most amazing stories of modern times, I think, in mathematics, which you might consider to be a boring topic. It certainly can be considered boring, but not when it comes to Grisha. He lived in Leningrad, and he still does. He's still alive and kicking, but he dropped out of mathematics basically with a curse. He said that mathematics is corrupt. He would know. He's probably the greatest mathematician who has ever lived. However, saying that always invokes the beauty pageant paradigm. Whenever you say something is the best, you're probably going to have to get ready for some controversy because someone else is going to say, no, it's someone else. So just take that with a grain of salt. That's my point of view. Conway was one of the greatest mathematicians of all time, and he probably deserved a Nobel Prize, but don't judge things by the Nobel Prize. He actually got 2 awards. I'm sorry, not Conway. Once you're dead, you can't get a Nobel Prize. And that's how Henrietta Leavitt missed out on a Nobel Prize, which Stockholm had nominated her for a Nobel Prize for her work in supporting Edwin Powell Hubble, because her discovery, or really the perfection, of the luminosity-periodicity relationship in Cepheid stars, which enabled Hubble in 1923, exactly 1 century ago, to discover a Cepheid star in Andromeda, which was necessary to get that kind of a star because it's a periodically varying in luminosity star. Because of its periodicity and luminosity, he was able to get a fix to a very high degree of precision on how far away was Andromeda, the galaxy. And from that, he opened up what we now call the space age. Okay, Grisha Perelman is not really part of our story because he deals or dealt in extraordinarily high-level mathematics, which is beyond the reach of a person like you or me. It just is. And what he did is he figured out one of the 7 Clay Prize puzzles in mathematics, which had been established by the Clay Institute with a $1 million prize for anyone who could figure out any one of 7 unsolved puzzles in mathematics. The one that Perelman figured out was basically the Poincaré conjecture. I'm not going to go into that because it's beyond me. I tried my best to understand what it is, and it's not easy because this stuff is very esoteric. But he won $1 million, and he turned it down. The first prize that he was given was the highly coveted Fields Medal in Mathematics. That entails a very substantial amount of money, which he turned down. 6 years later, he got the Clay Prize, basically for the same discovery, which is $1 million. And he turned that down. And then he said that mathematics is corrupt, and he dropped out of the picture, and he's never been heard from since. He refuses any interviews. He lives either with or close to his mother. Very good Russian. He lives a quiet life and is no longer interested in mathematics. Of course, from the American point of view, he's out of his mind, and in fact, many Russians are not too sure about him either. I take a completely different view. This man is one of my heroes. He's absolutely right about mathematics, but we're not going into that today. The reason I mention him is because he published his work in Archiv, which is where I'm going to publish my work as soon as I'm done with my LaTeX document, documenting the discovery of a brand new geometry with a brand new number system, which unlocks physics. So that is my thesis, which has been my thesis for coming up on 2 years now. That's the reason you're listening. That's not how I began. I have about 350 lectures out on the internet, mostly devoted to my original interest, which was giving tours of the universe so you and I can catch up on the discoveries that are already made. I'm not interested in theories, and I hope you're not interested in them either, because all the theories now concerning both cosmological science and quantum mechanics are impossible. There's a logjam, and it's due to our mathematical system. That's quite an amazing statement. So take that with a grain of salt until you get the proofs. If you want the proofs, that's why I produced most of those lectures in conjunction with my interest in galactic science, which is my original interest. I am not a mathematician nor a physicist. By trade, I am a database programmer, database engineer, and database manager. That's how I made my living for a couple of decades. And that's concerned with relational logic. So, that's why I mentioned Perelman, is because I'll be publishing in the same journal that he published in, or outlet, I suppose you could call it. The reason for mentioning Conway is his discovery of the definition of a number. I've expanded on that considerably. So there's our bracketing information for what we're going to do today, which is basically just one thing I want you to know about Ruđer Josip Bošković. 250 years ago, he made one of the most, well, not even one, is a profound insight into how the universe is constructed. So I'll be reading from his book. This is the preface to the reader, just so you can see where I'm going to begin, right there at the preface to the Vienna edition of this book. And that should be explanatory. I certainly hope it is, and I hope you enjoy this. I am trying to go as fast as I can because the attention span of an American viewer on YouTube is, you can't go fast in science. because you have to be sure of every single thing that you say. We're not allowed to guess. All right? Okay. So this is the preface to the reader in Ruđer Josip Bošković's monumental book, Theoria Philosophiae Naturalis. He wrote it in Latin. He was multilingual, as many men of that day were. Dear reader, you have before you a theory of natural philosophy deduced from a single law of forces. You will find in the opening paragraphs of the first section a statement as to where the theory has been already published in outline and to a certain extent explained, and also the occasion that led me to undertake a more detailed treatment and enlargement of it. For I have thought fit to divide the work into 3 parts, etc. Okay, that's from the preface. What I wanted you to hear, a single law of forces. Due to my exposure to modern astrophysics and quantum mechanics, which I've delved into in extraordinary detail to get what I want to know, which is the justification for my geometry. In order to write a LaTeX document for archive, you have to be sure that you're not repeating the work of anyone before. Also, to check to make sure that you're not making an error in trying to propound something which has already been disproved. None of that is true in the negative sense, and in the positive sense, I found an exact correlation with my discoveries and Rogers. His name is coming back up. I'm just going to mention one name of a man from Croatia whose work I'm studying right now. Dragoslav Stojković is a Boscovich expert, and he's not the only one. So there's our bracketing information. What I'd like to talk about now is what I discovered, which is, as I say, a geometry and a number system. The geometry that I discovered is the geometry of the sphere, and that's a very important object in geometry. Our number system that we use is based on the line. That's why it's called linear geometry and linear algebra. It's because all the numbers that we use are linear numbers. What I've discovered is that those linear numbers actually can be composed into reciprocal proportional numbers in an extraordinarily simple system. Ruđer Bošković announces in this preface that he has a single law of forces. So I'm going to talk about that, and we're going to close this off before a half an hour has elapsed. We have 10 minutes to do that. His single law of forces. You have seen, undoubtedly, diagrams of the Bohr atom. The Bohr atom, we call it the Bohr atom because the geometry of the atom is basically due to Bohr, Rutherford, and a few other men in the opening decades of the 20th century. So this is contemporaneous science. This is the cutting edge of science from that time. It's been only a century since that was discovered. That is, the atom. You know that it has a nucleus composed of positively charged protons. The neutron is very similar to the proton, and I've covered that in other lectures. What surrounds the protonic core are electrons in shells. And it's very interesting that they form shells. What's between the shells can only be called empty space, but it's more interesting than that. And this gets to the quantum paradox. What Rogers discovered before the atom was discovered was the curve of force balance pertaining to 2 particles in proximity, arbitrarily close proximity. We now know that that's subatomic particle proximity. The electron is considered to be a particle, and so is the proton. I maintain that those are the only 2 particles. You can disregard the standard model of particle physics. What that purports to describe are the shards of particles which are thrown out from a massively high-energy collision of two protons, typically in cyclotrons, such as the CERN cyclotron, and you've heard of other cyclotrons. These are enormously wasteful, government-sponsored cyclotrons, highly controversial now due to the enormous drain on the Earth resources imposed by these cyclotrons. But the government wants the power, having seen that fission energy comes from a knowledge of subatomic particle physics, and fusion energy, which is, of course, at the top of the list. But there's something even higher from the point of view of power-hungry governments, such as the United States government. Now, there's no politics here. I'm just saying the way things actually work in science. That's the reason for the incredible devotion to quantum mechanics, which now you know in the news, quantum computing. I'll be talking about that in future lectures, as I have in previous lectures. But today, we want to understand the force balance that Ruđer discovered and that I discovered what he actually discovered. He didn't know about the atom, and yet it is now fully admitted, fully conceded in top-level physics, although it's a slow process of admission because it conflicts with the industrial interests. And you don't want to be too far off course from the industrial interests, or you will not get government funding. And everything about high-energy physics, indeed for deep space exploration, is completely controlled by governments. Today, that basically means one government. So what is this force balance? Newton discovered, it's fair to say, that he discovered attractive force, which he called gravity, and we know a lot about that. Albert gave us a great deal of insight into gravity. The other force is light force. Light is actually a force. You can erect a sail in outer space, and there are actually patents in the patent office for this, and it's being worked on now. There are plans to have a craft with a light sail constructed perhaps around the moon so that it can be constructed in local space, and then unfurl the light sail so that you can use light the same way the energy of wind is used. So light does manifest a force. What I want you to know, to keep this extraordinarily simple, and it is simple, although the proofs get more intricate, science is about stating what you know. It should be something that can be understood, although then you have to be cautious. You need to see the proof, unless you're just willing to believe. Science is not about belief, it's about proof. Gravity is a centripetal force. If you're not aware of what that term means, it means a force that pulls in. Gravity is the centripetal force. There is another one, though. At the atomic level, the protons induce a centripetal force with respect to the electrons, and the electrons collect around the protonic core and form shells. Those are quantum shells. I have the mathematics for that. Ruđer has the algebraic curve for it. Just to give you a little bit of background on how I ran across all this information, I had already discovered the spherical number system and was exploring spherical geometry when in August of last year, just a little over a year ago, I encountered the name Bošković. It kept coming up, and so I took some time out to explore who this man was and what he had done. And I was absolutely dumbfounded, in a very good way, because Ruđer had already discovered the same things that I discovered, which are groundbreaking. So this force balance begins with gravity, but gravity is obviously related to protonic force. They're the only two centripetal pulling in forces. This is a spherically oriented force. And so sometimes gravity is called a pseudo-force for that reason. There is a reason why it's hard to say whether it's a pseudo-force or not. and I'll be mentioning at the end of this lecture very quickly, we're coming up on a half an hour, why that's doubtful. It's because it's a force you can consider it to be passive. Force is usually considered to be something like, an explosion or something you strike something and it moves. That's linear force, basically. But this is not linear force, it's spherical force. Albert said it looks like it bends space, and so he composed a linear algebra solution for gravity which bends both space and time. That is incorrect, and I've proved that. He's very close to getting the right answer, but linear algebra is incapable of reaching the right solution. That's painfully obvious now. We call it the quantum mechanical paradox. It has a reciprocal to it, or you could say inverse, and the relationship between reciprocal and inverse is a major discovery, which I made. Ruđer could not make it, but I did. Inverse, basically we think of that as being in two opposite linear directions, but reciprocal, that's different, and I've proved that that's a 90-degree angle in spherical space. The two forces that you need to be aware of that are in balance, in evidence in the atom, but it goes far beyond that, there are two forces in balance. And Newton did not know that, and nobody's figured it out since. The so-called grand unification theory, which is somewhat altered in meaning, basically what we're talking about is the unification of electrodynamics with gravity. You've heard of quantum loop gravity, or there's various theories of how to unify electrodynamics with gravity. Gravity is not a quantum phenomenon. Yes, it is, and I'll show that to you. To begin, at the simplest place to begin is at the center. The protons manifest a center. You could say a center to the universe, but it's kind of grandiose to put it that way, but it is ultimately true, because a center has to have an edge. But there is no edge to the universe. So when you say the center of gravity, you're talking about a local phenomenon. And that's really what an atom is. It's a local, very local, about as local as you can get. But now the reason for the interest in the nucleus, which is why protons are being collided together, is to see what's inside of it. A man named Gell-Mann discovered a mathematical relationship in the protonic system. That is, whatever a proton is, it's now considered to be made of 3 quarks. And those are not particles, but they're called particles because there's no other word. They have to call them particles, and that's one reason for the standard model. There's about 26 particles. None of those are particles. But you see, as part of the quantum paradox, we're not sure whether they're particles or not, but we have no other word except wave. And these can't really be waves, or you can't measure them as such to identify what they are. So all of that is very brief. I'll be going into that in extraordinary detail, as I have in the past, but I know American viewers just don't have the time to go through, dozens or scores. I actually have 350 lectures on this topic and related topics with it. This is incredible. But to get back to the point, to close this out, we're now at 30 minutes. The other force is centrifugal force. And those have to be in balance in the whole universe, because space is being pulled in by the protons. That's centripetal force. And gravity actually is commonly admitted, but we don't have a proof. But you can see it. If gravity is a centripetal force, and it's based on mass, which is protons, obviously they're related. But we don't have the mathematics to prove it. And that's what's being sought at top-level physics right now, in the abstract sense, for understanding, which is what you and I are after. We're not after a bomb or a weapon or power, whether for good or evil. We're after understanding. So there's centrifugal force and centripetal force. We know what the centripetal force is. It's manifested locally as both the atomic system, which has a center, and gravity, which is an integration of protonic force. That is obvious. But you still have to prove it. Science is a bitch that way. You do have to prove it, but we all know that it's true. But that science is rigorous. But those are the only two centripetal forces. So you have to ask yourself, where's the force balance for centripetal force? There has to be an equal and opposite force. That's centrifugal force. I identified what that is, and it's so obvious that it's somewhat disconcerting that nobody ever noticed this. There are reasons for that, and people may have noticed it, but without proof, you can't go on because science requires proof. I've got the proof, and the centrifugal force is EMR. It's light. Light is the centrifugal force, and it's the only centrifugal force in the universe as a basic, inherent, intrinsic force of the universe. That's 32 minutes, 33. So we're done for now. I hope you're enticed by this, a spherical geometry that explains the Boscovich force balance. He said that when two particles get close to each other, such as an electron to a protonic core or two protons, these are two different curves, and he identified both of them. But in the atom, we do understand the atom. The electrons get close. I'll just say one proton with one electron, that forms hydrogen. That electron always maintains exactly the same distance. It doesn't vary. It forms a spherical shell around the proton. Well, that is obviously spherical geometry. We don't have a spherical geometry. Let me correct that. We did not have a spherical geometry until 2022, when I discovered spherical geometry and the explanation for Ruggiero Josip Bošković's force curve, which I did not know at the time of discovery, but now it all fits. The two forces manifest in the atom are indeed centrifugal and centripetal force. It's not just pulling in. The proton is pulling in, but it's pulling in spatially. When light goes out, it does not go out spatially, although you could say that it goes out spatially because it does go through space, but it also traverses time. And I have identified the centrifugal force that balances centripetal force, which completely balances universal everything. It's universal physics. This is the unification theory. It's no longer a theory. I've proved it. But now I have to publish because in science you have to get consensuality. I know that what I've discovered, that's not good enough for science. This now needs to be published. I'm completely unknown, and so you're hearing now the Fermi Edge of Science. That's 35 minutes. This is Anagalactic, bringing you the secret of the universe. And we'll be back with you. Be sure you keep looking up. It's still new moon time, and it's still warm out. Although not everywhere, because it's now mid-October. So God bless you. I hope that you're enjoying the universe that you live in. And we'll be back with the secret of the universe, the answer to everything.